Pink Floyd didn't just record albums, they engineered accidents that redefined sound itself. From band radio hits to the illegal math behind Animals, this is the definitive deep dive into their studio secrets. 5 legendary stories, one ultimate collection. Let's head back to the studio.
It's June 5th, 1975, Abbey Road, Studio 3. Pink Floyd are 4 hours into a backing vocal session for Shine On You, Crazy Diamond, a 9-part piece they have spent 6 months building as a tribute to their lost friend, Syd Barrett. A stranger walks in. Shaved head, shaved eyebrows, heavyset, carrying a plastic shopping bag, wearing a worn, tan Mac. David Gilmour glances across, looks again. He nudges Nick Mason. Mason looks, shrugs. Gilmour leans in and says the name. Roger Waters breaks down in tears. Syd Barrett had not been in a studio with Pink Floyd since 1968. He had not been a functioning musician since 1972. Nobody in the room had recognized him. And nobody, including Barrett, understood, or at least acknowledged, that the song they were recording was about him. The Dark Side of the Moon was released on March 1, 1973. Within 2 years, it had spent more consecutive weeks on the US Billboard 200 than any album in recorded history. It was on the charts, it was everywhere, and for Pink Floyd, it had become a weight.
It was a very difficult period for us, I have to say. All your childhood dreams had been sort of realized. We had the biggest selling record in the world, and we had made money, and all the things that you got into it for.
All 4 described the aftermath the same way. Not exhilaration, exhaustion, disorientation, a sense that the commercial machinery they had walked into was now operating on its own, and they were inside it.
It was a very, very uncomfortable period, and that it was not a great tour, doing those 3 bits of music. It's not a good fun period.
By January 1975, when they returned to Abbey Road, they arrived with 3 compositions sketched on the road. A piece called Raving and Drooling, a piece called You Gotta Be Crazy, and the beginnings of Shine On You, Crazy Diamond. The first 2 were shelved before the album was half-formed. 2 years later, they would be reworked and retitled for Animals. Raving and Drooling became Dogs. You Gotta Be Crazy became Sheep. But in January 1975, they belonged to an album that didn't yet know what it wanted to be. Engineer Brian Humphreys, who had worked with the band on More and had managed their live sound on the 1974 UK tour, stepped in for Alan Parsons, who had decamped to begin his own project. Humphreys arrived at Studio 3 to find new equipment that nobody, including the studio staff, knew how to operate. Abbey Road had just installed a Studer A80 24-track machine alongside an EMI-modified Neve console. Humphreys. We were like guinea pigs, and I was the main guinea pig. It was one of the first times EMI had worked with a freelancer. The unfamiliar board would force the band to re-record Shine On You, Crazy Diamond almost from scratch. Excessive bleed from the new console had contaminated the drum tracks. And the sessions themselves. I don't think they knew what they wanted to do, Humphreys recalled. We had a dartboard and an air rifle, and we'd play these word games, sit around, get drunk, go home, and return the next day. This went on for weeks.
Motions, and Nick was playing the drums, but really wasn't putting his heart into it, because Dark Side of the Moon was just, huge success.
At some point during those weeks, Roger Waters called a meeting. The band sat in the circle at Abbey Road. Waters took notes. We all sat round and unburdened ourselves a lot, and I took notes on what everybody was saying. It was a meeting about what wasn't happening and why. What wasn't happening was music. What was happening was a quiet, collective drift.
This record is now about absence. This song doesn't fit and it shouldn't be on it.
Waters. No one was really looking each other in the eye, and it was all very mechanical. He made a decision. The album would be about exactly that. Not despite the paralysis, because of it. The emotional truth of the sessions would become the subject of the record. The machine they could feel grinding around them. The absence at the center of everything they were doing. Shine On You Crazy Diamond. 9 parts, built over a 4-note guitar motif by Gilmour, lyrics by Waters, would be split into 2 halves. 2 new songs would be placed between them, framing the whole thing like a question and its unanswerable echo. Gilmour opposed this structure. He was outvoted 3-1. Welcome to the Machine was primarily Waters' composition.
I thought that was great. I love that kind of rhythmic effect, and it was kind of breaking new ground musically and in those days.
Tape loops, synthesizers, a portrait of the music industry as a processing facility that takes human beings in one end and produces product from the other. Have a Cigar followed.
One would meet an awful lot of record company people who would have that sort of have a cigar mentality, and I don't know quite what made Rogers start writing that one, but...
Written by Waters, sung in the voice of a record executive. And did we tell you the name of the Game Boy? Waters recorded the vocal first. Someone in the room was unkind about it. Gilmour tried next and stopped. He later offered 2 explanations. The range wasn't right for his voice, and, separately, that he did not share Waters' views on the music industry as the lyric required. He could not deliver a conviction he didn't hold. Roy Harper was recording in the adjacent studio. He owed Gilmour a favor. Gilmour had given him guitar lines for a recent session. Harper agreed to sing Have a Cigar. Waters has since said he wishes the vocal had come out more vulnerable, less cynical. Gilmour called it the perfect version. Pink Floyd wrote a song satirizing the music industry's exploitation of artists. Neither of its principal members would sing it. The man who finally did was in the building by accident. 2 U.S. tours interrupted the sessions, April 1975 and June 1975. The band toured while the album remained unfinished, then returned to Abbey Road. By early June, the end was in sight. They were recording the backing vocals for Shine On You Crazy Diamond. On June 5th, the stranger arrived.
And he, just for some incredible reason, he picked the very day that we were doing a song which was about him. And we hadn't seen him, I don't think, for 2 years before.
Gilmour recognized him first. He nudged Mason. Mason looked and shrugged. Gilmour whispered the name. Nick Mason's account from his memoir Inside Out is the most precise. He describes looking over at a large, fat bloke with a shaven head wearing a decrepit old tan Mac and carrying a plastic shopping bag. He had not recognized Syd Barrett. Barrett had gained considerable weight. He had shaved his head and his eyebrows. He had been living in isolation, he told someone in the room, eating too much. He appeared to be in reasonable spirits. He was enthusiastic. He asked if you could help with the recording. He sat and listened to the playback of Shine On You Crazy Diamond. 9 parts, assembled across 6 months as a tribute to himself, and showed no sign of recognizing that this was the case. Roger Waters wept.
Roger was in tears. We were both in tears. It was very shocking.
The others held it together. Later that evening, Barrett said he thought he had a 9 o'clock appointment somewhere. He left. Nobody is certain where. He took a taxi. They watched him go. It was the last time any of them would see him in a professional context. Barrett died in 2006. He had lived for more than 30 years in Cambridge, largely in seclusion, painting and tending a garden. He never recorded again. Wish You Were Here was released on September 12, 1975. Harvest Records in the UK, Columbia in the United States, the band's first American release on Columbia after leaving Capitol. Advance orders in the UK alone had reached 250,000 before the record was in shops. It debuted at number 1 in Britain. It hit number 1 in the United States on October 4th. It has sold more than 20 million copies worldwide. The sleeve, designed by Storm Thorgerson, shipped the album in opaque black polythene. The artwork was invisible. The cover of an album about absence was itself absent. Columbia objected. They were overruled. When the band were shown the pre-production mock-up, they gave a spontaneous round of applause. On the next album, Animals, Roger Waters would consolidate complete creative control. On the Wall, Richard Wright was fired, then rehired as a paid session musician, a daily rate, because his keyboards were needed. He was the only member of Pink Floyd who made money on the Wall. The machine had processed all of them. By 1983, Waters had left, declaring the band finished.
You know, because I suddenly discovered that all I had to do was be honest and say what I felt, and I discovered I had a knack of being honest and saying what I feel.
Waters called the sessions torturous.
Important is I think, for yourself to do it. If you want to be creative in any way, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be Michelangelo, you know, or John Lennon. You can just be you and do it at home. Do it for fun.
He described the meeting to discuss what had gone wrong as a meeting about what wasn't happening. He then made an album called Wish You Were Here, an album about absence, made in the absence of everything that had made the band work. The peculiar thing about Wish You Were Here is that it knows all of this. The satire of Have a Cigar is too accurate to be comfortable. The grief of Shine On is too specific to be general.
It's so important to every day in my life, and in my view, in everyone's life. You know, I wish you were here, because we fail to make the connections that we ought to.
The title track, 2 acoustic guitars, the simplest thing they recorded that year, is a man asking someone who isn't there whether they have exchanged a walk-on part in the war for a lead role in a cage. Barrett walked through the door and didn't recognize himself in the music. The rest of them recognized themselves perfectly. That is what makes the album unbearable, and why it endures.
Imagine this. One long, wordless scream rips through Abbey Road studios. No melody, no lyrics, just pure emotion. The voice belongs to a 25-year-old session singer named Claire Torrey. 45 seconds, 30 quid. And suddenly that scream is the beating heart of an album that'll sell 45 million copies. An album that spent 741 weeks on the Billboard charts, longer than some artists' entire careers. From a one-take vocal performance that changed music history, to antique clocks, pub interviews, and a lawsuit that took decades to resolve. Today, we're opening the vault to reveal the secrets behind the making of the dark side of the moon. By May 1972, Pink Floyd had already played the suite live for months, calling it Eclipse before it grew up into the dark side of the moon. Pink Floyd were already known as pioneers of psychedelic rock, but they were drifting. Endless experimental jams, half-finished ideas, and a lack of direction threatened to leave them behind as the rock world moved forward.
We're in danger of not getting the balance quite right, between the words and the music.
Roger Waters came up with a solution, an album built around one unifying theme: the pressures of life and the madness it can cause. That concept would tie the songs together. Time, money, war, death, and insanity. This vision gave the band purpose, and what followed at Abbey Road Studios would become one of the most innovative recording sessions in history. One of the most unforgettable moments on the album is The Great Gig in the Sky. But here's the secret. It was never supposed to be a centerpiece. Initially, it was just Richard Wright playing a piano piece about mortality.
I'm very proud of this piece as a musician and the way the chord structure works.
In that January 1973, at the last minute, producer Alan Parsons brought in a 25-year-old session singer named Claire Torrey. She was told, "Sing as if your voice is an instrument. Don't use words. Just feel it."
That was what was remarkable about her performance on that. She just improvised away and no words, just wailing.
What happened next was lightning in a bottle.
And I thank Claire Torrey for that magic day when she put the voice on.
In one take, Torrey delivered a raw, wordless cry of anguish that captured the fear of death better than any lyric ever could.
I went up to Abbey Road. I had no idea what it was. Nobody told me. I didn't know whether I was going to walk into the studio. There was going to be a choir, 2 other girls, 3 other girls. No idea.
She walked away thinking she'd failed. Instead, she created one of the greatest vocal performances in rock history. She was paid just £30.
Today, I just can't believe the effect it has on me and I guess everyone else.
Only in 2004, Torrey sued for a co-write and won, finally claiming royalties from the 45 million selling album. Claire Torrey settled her lawsuit with Pink Floyd and EMIs for an undisclosed sum in 2005. While the specific amount was never revealed, the out-of-court settlement recognized her claim that her improvisational, wailing vocals on The Great Gig in the Sky effectively constituted co-authorship with keyboardist Richard Wright. The settlement also awarded her vocal composition credit and a share of future songwriting royalties. Her net worth is today estimated at $10 million. The iconic sounds on The Dark Side of the Moon weren't created with synthesizers. They were painstakingly recorded. For the song Time, Alan Parsons went into an antique shop and recorded every tick, clack, and chime from a shelf of ancient clocks, one after another. Later, he stitched the best 24 ticks across 4 machines, each slightly detuned, into a multi-track loop that became the song's eerie intro. For money, Roger Waters took an ordinary cash register, tore paper, jingled coins, and created a tape loop in 7/4 time. That rhythmic loop wasn't just a gimmick, it became the heartbeat of the entire track.
And I've always believed that's the best Floyd music has come from that, actually.
These sounds weren't samples or presets. They were built by hand, with scissors, tape, and hours of trial and error. Throughout the album, strange voices appear, laughing, confessing, or muttering cryptic lines. Where did they come from? The band set up microphones in Abbey Road's studio hallways and interviewed anyone who happened to be around. Roadies, engineers, staff, even the doorman. They were asked the same questions. When did you last hit someone? Are you frightened of dying? What's the dark side of the moon, anyway? The answers were unscripted and deeply human. Henry McCullough, guitarist for Wings, said, "I don't know, I was really drunk at the time." Another voice, from roadie Roger, the Hat Manifold, laughed about fighting. And at the end of Eclipse, you hear a faint voice saying, "There is no dark side of the moon, really. As a matter of fact, it's all dark." It is coming from studio's Irish doorman, Jerry O'Driscoll. He also said, "Not included on the album. The only thing that makes it look a light is the sun." Paul and Linda McCartney were also interviewed, but their answers were not used as the band thought they were trying too hard to be funny. Waters cherry-picked the rawest snippets and sprinkled them across the album. It wasn't poetry written by Waters. It was real people, caught in unguarded moments. The album also broke ground technologically. The band used the EMS Synthi AKS and VCS-3 synthesizers, some of the earliest portable synths. On the track On the Run, David Gilmour never touched a guitar. Instead, he punched a frantic 16-step pattern into the built-in sequencer, cranked the thing through tape delay, and rode the filter knob like a pilot, wrestling a 747 in a hurricane.
This was a new version that had one of the very first sequencers in it.
That was the big innovation, was that the Synth EA had a sequencer, which was just the first sequencer I'd ever seen.
The quadraphonic mix, essentially an early attempt at surround sound, let the band move effects around the listener. In concerts, the sound of footsteps or planes could race across the audience from speaker to speaker, years before surround systems were common. The band wasn't just writing music, they were building a sonic world. They mixed the album on Abbey Road's brand new EMI TG 12345 console, the building's first solid-state desk. Cleaner headroom meant the low end on the On the Run could thunder without muddying the delicate highs. Parsons spent whole nights riding faders by hand so the mixers breathed. When the mastering engineer cut the lacquer, he had to widen the grooves to cope with the seismic bass. Yet the quiet passages remain so intimate, you feel someone whispering in your ear. Half a century later, the record still sounds like it comes from next week. When The Dark Side of the Moon was released in 1973, it wasn't just another record. It was a cultural event. It gave shape to universal fears and experiences, from birth to death, using sounds no one had heard before. And maybe that's why it still resonates, because behind the perfect production lies the imperfect, the accidents, the arguments, the raw human voices. That's the real secret of The Dark Side of the Moon.
In 1980, Pink Floyd did the impossible. They turned a rock concert into a living, breathing architectural nightmare. Giant puppets, a 40-foot wall full of bricks, and the sound so perfect, so layered that it seemed to defy the laws of live physics. I was struck by the thought that there was a huge wall that you couldn't see between me and the audience, and they thought I was mad. But if you were in the front row, something didn't quite add up.
In my opinion, it's just miles ahead of anything else that's ever been done in rock and roll.
You see, the Wall Tour wasn't just a concert, it was a massive $10 million clockwork machine. And at the heart of that machine was a secret. A secret that Roger Waters and David Gilmour hoped you'd never hear. Today we are cracking open the vault on the multi-track tapes Pink Floyd used to fake the most legendary tour in history. This isn't just about backing vocals, it's about 1980 tape trick that saved Pink Floyd from financial ruin, and the technical genius that bridged the gap between the studio masterpiece and the live impossibility. To understand why they had to do it, we have to look at the album itself. The Wall wasn't just songs, it was a sonic collage. Bob Ezrin, the producer, had filled the tracks with orchestral swells, sound effects of dive bombers, children screaming, and some of the most complex vocal harmonies ever recorded. In 1979, the technology to recreate that live didn't exist, not for a 4-piece band. Roger Waters wanted perfection. He wanted the audience to feel the isolation of the wall, but he also knew that if a single brick fell out of sync with the music, the illusion would shatter. If the plane didn't crash into the wall exactly at the climax of In the Flesh, the show was a joke. They were trapped. They had a studio album that was literally too big to play.
This was going to be a record, 3 or 4 cities, and a movie, because I knew it couldn't possibly travel.
The solution came from the world of cinema. They didn't just play to a metronome, they played to a ghost.
And I think that's quite an interesting... Put it like this, it interested me to realise that what seems to have been a grand plan was nothing of the sort.
Behind the stage sat a massive 35mm magnetic film playback system. It wasn't just playing sound effects. It was carrying a multi-track skeleton of the entire show.
Music that you're hearing is live from the band. There's 1 or 2 things we've got for cue tracks, click tapes, just so that we can sync in with sound effects. We've got various sound effects that were on the album.
On track 1, the click, this was a relentless mechanical pulse fed into the band's headphones.
The people who know what they're doing and get on with it. In The Wall, it was a little more technical, and there was an awful lot of synchronization going on.
If Nick Mason drifted by even a millisecond, the entire visual show, the projectors, the puppets, everything would be ruined. But tracks 2 through 8? That's where things get controversial. They didn't just have sound effects, they had the orchestral parts from the studio.
Those projectors are driving one of our 8-track machines over there, which has a full orchestra tape sound on it. If we have any problems at all with the projectors, then it affects the sound as well.
They had the massive vocal layers for songs like The Show Must Go On. In some cases, even the lead guitars were reinforced. Critics called it faking. Pink Floyd called it architecture. Nothing illustrates the fake nature of the tour better than the opening. For years, fans wondered how the band could look so different at the start of the show. It turns out the people on stage during the first song weren't Pink Floyd at all. It was a surrogate band wearing masks of the real members' faces, while the real Pink Floyd sat in the dark. The surrogate band mimed through, you guessed it, the secret tapes. It was the ultimate meta-commentary of the falseness of rock stardom. They were literally faking being themselves while the audience cheered for a recording. That was really a kind of theatrical shock tactic, because people would assume that it was us and suddenly realize that it wasn't. The sheer scale of this tape trick went even deeper than the music. You have to remember, the 1980 World Tour was a financial disaster before it even began. It couldn't possibly travel because of the sheer expense of getting this thing to move. It was miles ahead of anything that had been done in rock and roll. The weight of the equipment and the insurance costs meant the band was bleeding money. They couldn't afford a single mistake.
There's no point, really. It's incredibly expensive to do. It's an enormous amount of effort goes into it.
This is where the multitracks became a safety net. It was all special equipment. I mean, it was absurdly expensive, but it was great to have done it once. If a guitar cable snapped or a synth went out of tune, the ghost in the machine kept the audience from noticing.
One night in New York, we were halfway into the show, and the awful moment happened when suddenly the tape machine stopped. And luckily Nigel, who's running the maintenance back here, managed to get the whole thing organised.
There are rumors among roadies that on the single nights when Roger Waters was failing, the tapes were pushed higher in the mix, blending his live stranded vocals with the studio perfect tracks from 1979. It was a high wire act where the wire was made of magnetic tape. But the most chilling part of this technical deception was the click track itself.
I had the whole show written out on a huge long piece of paper that was hanging back there somewhere with all the notes for what had to happen next, all the way through.
For a band like Pink Floyd, who had spent the 70s famously drifting through psychedelic jams, being chained to a mechanical pulse, was a form of artistic imprisonment. Nick Mason has since described the experience as utterly exhausting. Imagine playing some of the most emotional music of your career while a robotic thump, thump, thump screams in your ear for 2 hours, reminding you that if you move too fast, you'll ruin a $10 million spectacle. The lie wasn't just for the audience, it was a gauge for the band as well. They had built a wall between themselves and the music, sacrificing the liveness of rock and roll for the clinical precision of a film set.
Between the audience sitting on the other side of the wall as such, and the band playing over the wall. There's definitely an interface there. In this instance, it's a wall.
By the time the final brick was laid and the wall came crashing down, the band wasn't just performing the story of isolation. They were living it, trapped behind the literal and sonic barrier of their own making. I did not just want to walk out of this great thing I've been working on. I just decided I'd go out and play my best. Was this the moment Pink Floyd stopped being a band and starting being a brand? Today, every major pop star uses backing tracks. It's the industry standard. But in 1980, this was unheard of. Pink Floyd were the pioneers of the live hybrid performance.
I think it was artificial, but I think possibly there was the side that wanted to do inflatables and films as well as music, and those who just wanted to do music.
They realized that the audience didn't want a jam session. They wanted the concept. And if that meant using secret tapes to ensure the wall fell perfectly when the drums hit that final beat, then so be it. They risked everything, including their reputation as real musicians, to create a perfect lie. The wall show will be the touchstone against which all future rock spectacles must be measured. And in the end, that lie became the most iconic tour in the history of music. But was it worth it? Or did the reliance on tapes kill the soul of the band? Pink Floyd's Animals only has 5 songs. Roger Waters is credited on all 5, 4 of them alone. By now, Roger was in full flow with the ideas, but he was also really keeping Dave down and frustrating him deliberately. David Gilmour co-wrote Dogs, a 17-minute masterpiece that takes up nearly half the entire album. But in the music business, songwriting royalties are often split per song, not per minute. That means the man who wrote half the music of the record only collected about 10% of the publishing. Meanwhile, the 2 shortest tracks on the album, barely 90 seconds each, are actually just one song Roger Waters cut in 2. By splitting it, he turned 1 credit into 2. I formed this band, for God's sake, and I helped Roger a hell of a lot, because he wasn't a musician when we started. Every fault line that eventually shattered Pink Floyd is visible right there, printed on the back of the sleeve. This is how the math of Animals broke the band.
And it became clear to me after doing 1 or 2, from the conversation backstage and from the response in front of the stage and for the things that happened afterwards and from the injuries and the this and the that and the general vibe I got, that this was no longer musicians writing and performing songs, and well, it was, but that was no longer important. What had become important was the gross.
By 1977, Pink Floyd had moved into Britannia Row, their own private studio. Without an outside producer or a label executive to tell them no, Roger Waters took total control of the narrative. The concept was loosely inspired by George Orwell's Animal Farm. Dogs as the ruthless ladder climbers, pigs as the tyrants, and sheep as the mindless masses.
A decision was made to take this very artistic photograph of a large pig flying over Battersea Power Station. And so the large pig was built and inflated and taken down to Battersea. And there was a crew of riggers and inflators and everything else. And there was also a highly paid marksman whose job was to deflate the pig with a well-placed shot in the event of it escaping.
No one disputes that the lyrics and the concept were Roger's, but the music was a different story. Dogs was originally a song called You Got to Be Crazy. The band had been playing it for years in live. Roger and I went out in the big room with 2 guitars and wrote the chord sequence for the verses together. And he went off and wrote the words. Gilmour wrote the vast majority of that music. It's the only shared credit on the album, and it takes up almost all of side 1. But look at Pigs on the Wing. It's a short acoustic love song Roger wrote for his wife. He split it down the middle. Part 1 opens the album, Part 2 closes it. To a royalty accountant, those are 2 separate compositions, 1 extra credit for Roger with 0 extra work. When Roger left in 1985, he called Pink Floyd a spent force. He honestly believed that because he owned the majority of the math on the recent albums, the band belonged to him. Pink Floyd is a spent force creatively. He sued Gilmour and Mason to stop them from using the name. He lost. The men who stood together to create 17-minute epic Dogs spent the next decade communicating only through lawyers. I spent 20 years of my life building that name up. I see no reason why I should give that up just because one guy says he doesn't want to do it anymore. You'd think after 40 years the dust would have settled, but in 2018 a new remix of Animals was completed. It sat on a shelf unreleased for 4 years. Why? Because Roger and David couldn't agree on the liner notes. Roger wanted the notes to detail exactly who did what, essentially highlighting his dominance on the sessions.
And this is true today as it was then, that like I said before, rules are made to be broken, and we've never had any sacred idea about what we think we ought to be or what we ought to sound like. So anytime we feel like trying something else out, we'll just go and try it. And if some of the fans do or don't like it, it's not really particularly relevant, because that's not the way we do things. That's not why we do things. We do them for us first, and if the fans like it, they like it.
David felt the notes were revisionist and downplayed the band's collective effort. He has for the last 35 years told a lot of whooping porky pies about who did what in Pink Floyd when I was still in charge. We have a video about that in more detail, so you might want to watch that. It's pretty well made, I think. The remix finally came out in 2022, but only after the liner notes were removed entirely. Roger eventually published his version of the story on his own website. Even half a century later, Animals is an album that cannot be released without a fight over who truly owns the music.
For decades, Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall has been the ultimate anthem against tyrannical teachers. The song's most powerful story isn't about a school in Britain, but a revolution in South Africa.
On May 2nd, 1980, the South African government banned Another Brick in the Wall, making international headlines. That apartheid government imposed a cultural blockade, so to speak, on certain songs, including mine, Roger Waters said at the time.
This is the incredible story of how a rock song, born from one man's personal pain, became a weapon against an oppressive government. It's about how a ban, meant to silence a generation, only made their voices louder and created a legacy the band could have never dreamed of. This is the story of what happens when a song becomes something more. To understand how a song gets banned by an entire government, you have to know where it came from. And for Another Brick in the Wall, it all started with a single memory. The song was the centerpiece of the 1979 album, The Wall, a rock opera that was the brainchild of Pink Floyd's bassist and main lyricist, Roger Waters. The Wall is a deeply personal story about abandonment, isolation, and the emotional barriers we build. The main character, Pink, is basically a stand-in for Waters himself, and the bricks are the traumas that wall him off from the world. One of his biggest traumas? School. Waters hated his time in the British education system, seeing it as a rigid, oppressive machine designed to crush individuality, not nurture it. He saw teachers as enforcers of conformity who used dark sarcasm in the classroom to keep kids in line. The song wasn't arguing for illiteracy. It was a protest against a very specific kind of education, one that demanded thought control and churned out compliant, identical citizens. Like sausages from a meat grinder, just like in the movie. To give the track its iconic punch, producer Bob Ezrin had a stroke of genius. He'd worked with Alice Cooper on School's Out, and as he put it, had a thing about kids on record. So he suggested a real children's choir. An engineer found a class at the nearby Islington Green School in London, and their music teacher loved the idea. A group of 23 kids came into the studio, and their voices were layered over and over to sound like a massive youth army chanting in unison, "We don't need no education, we don't need no thought control." The effect was electric. When it was released as a single, the song shot to #1 in 14 countries, selling millions. But with success came controversy. Back in the UK, politicians and educators were aghast. The Inner London Education Authority called the song scandalous, and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher reportedly hated it. They saw it as an attack on authority and a dangerous encouragement of rebellion.
Roger Waters later remembered, "People were really driven to frenzies of rage by it. He argued they were missing the point by taking the lyrics out of context."
But as the Archbishop of Canterbury wisely noted at the time, if the song was that popular with kids, it must be tapping into some genuine feelings they had, and that alone was worth talking about. But while Britain was debating the song's meaning, halfway across the world, a generation of students heard it not as a metaphor, but as a literal truth. They were about to turn a personal protest into a global symbol of resistance. As Another Brick in the Wall was topping charts in early 1980, it landed in a nation on the verge of exploding, apartheid-era South Africa. For decades, the country had been ruled by a brutal system of racial segregation. That system bled into everything, especially education. The government's policy, the Bantu Education Act of 1953, was explicitly designed to give black students an inferior education. One report from Stanford University put it bluntly. It was meant to limit educational potential and keep black citizens trapped in the working class. It was an education system built to oppress, not to enlighten. In February 1980, right as the Pink Floyd anthem was climbing the charts, students began boycotting their schools to protest these inequalities. The movement spread like wildfire. And in the lyrics of this British rock song, they found their rallying cry, chanting, "We don't need no education, we don't need no thought control in the streets." They transformed the song from a critique of a dreary English school into a direct condemnation of apartheid's doctrine. The song perfectly captured their feeling of being oppressed by a system. The apartheid government watched this with growing alarm. The state had a department with sweeping censorship powers, able to ban any media it decided was politically or morally undesirable. The song, now inseparable from the student uprising, was directly in its crosshairs. A religious group had already complained it would create an environment for communism, but its adoption by protesters sealed its fate. On May 2, 1980, the South African government officially banned Another Brick in the Wall. The song was yanked from the radio, and the album was pulled from stores. It was a desperate act of censorship meant to crush the rebellion. But it backfired spectacularly. The ban made international headlines, turning the song into a global symbol of the struggle. It cemented the track's status as an anti-apartheid anthem and drew a clear line in the sand.
Roger Waters would later call the government's move a cultural blockade. In solidarity, Pink Floyd refused to perform in South Africa as long as apartheid stood, joining the global cultural boycott.
The protests didn't stop. The boycotts grew more intense and were met with violence. Police shootings during these protests led to the deaths of over 40 people, and by 1985, the government had declared a state of emergency. The song may have been silenced on the airwaves, but its echo was deafening. By banning it, the South African government had amplified its power beyond anything Roger Waters could have ever intended. They took a brick from his personal, metaphorical wall and made it a foundation stone in a generation's fight for freedom. So how long was the song actually banned? The official government ban lasted about 10 years, from May 1980 until it was finally lifted around 1990 as the apartheid regime began to fall apart. So why the 30 years in the title? Well, that number really represents the long shadow this whole era cast, from the songs released in '79, through the decade of the ban, and all the way to a time when its incredible story could finally be told in a free South Africa. And that's what makes the story of this song so incredible. It shows how art can take on a life of its own. It started as one artist's reflection on his own childhood, a wall built of personal bricks.
Roger Waters himself admitted it was never meant to be some crass revolutionary standpoint, yet its message of defiance against unjust authority was so universal that it connected with thousands of young people facing a very real, very physical wall of oppression.
They didn't just hear a song, they heard their own struggle, their own anger, and their own hope. The ban in South Africa is the most dramatic chapter in the song's history. But it wasn't the only place it caused a stir. Teachers in the United States worried it would start rebellions in their own classrooms, and radio stations debated even playing it. But despite all the controversy, or maybe because of it, the song became an enduring global phenomenon. It proved that when a message is powerful enough, no ban can ever truly silence it. Today, Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 stands as a landmark protest anthem. Its legacy is twofold. It's a timeless symbol of youthful rebellion against any form of oppressive authority, whether in a classroom or a government. But more profoundly, its history is a testament to the unintended power of art. It shows how a song can be a catalyst, starting a debate in one country and fueling a revolution in another. The wall Roger Waters wrote about was a metaphorical one, but in the streets of South Africa, his song helped bring a real one tumbling down. It's 1971, and David Gilmour is alone in Abbey Road studios, frustrated and exhausted. He's been experimenting with effects for hours, trying to create something, anything, that could capture the otherworldly atmosphere Pink Floyd desperately needed for their new album.
Often doesn't really work quite that way in the studio. It's not down to a musical rapport between us.
His fingers are cramped, his ears are ringing, and in a moment of careless fatigue, he makes a simple mistake. He wires his wah-wah pedal backwards. What happens next would accidentally create one of the most haunting and recognizable sounds in rock history.
But we are very into sort of timeless, ageless, spacious sort of moods in our music, very often atmospheric.
A sound so perfect, so ethereal, that it would define not just a song, but an entire era of progressive rock.
But we'd used this same trick before on echoes.
This is the story of how a studio accident became Pink Floyd's greatest sonic achievement. The year 1971 was make or break for Pink Floyd. They had just lost their founding member and creative genius, Syd Barrett, and the pressure was mounting to prove they could survive without him. Roger Waters was pushing the band toward more conceptual territory, while Gilmour was still finding his voice as the new lead guitarist.
Playing with these sort of rhythms and sounds on stage at sound checks, probably in the late 60s, but I never quite found where to use it until Echoes.
The sessions for what would become Medal were tense, experimental, and often frustrating. Gilmour had always been a perfectionist, spending countless hours tweaking his sound, searching for that perfect tone that would set Pink Floyd apart from every other band of the era. He was known to arrive at the studio early and stay late, often working alone with just the engineer, exploring the possibilities of his equipment in ways that would have seemed impossible to previous generations of musicians. The wah-wah pedal, a relatively new piece of technology at the time, was supposed to create that classic sweeping sound that had become popular in the late 60s. When wired correctly, it would start with a low, muffled tone and sweep upward to a bright, cutting sound as you rocked the pedal forward. But Gilmour, in his tired state, had connected the wires in reverse. When he first struck the chord and began to rock the pedal, instead of the familiar wah sound, something completely unexpected emerged from his amplifier. The effect was inverted, creating an ascending pitch that sounded nothing like a guitar. It was high, piercing, and strangely organic. It sounded like the cry of a seagull, or perhaps some mythical sea creature calling across an endless ocean. But this wasn't actually the first time this sound had appeared in Pink Floyd's work. If you listen carefully to their earlier experimental piece, called Embryo, recorded during sessions in February 1970, you can hear the earliest version of this effect. Gilmour had been experimenting with the backwards wiring even then, but it was during the Medal sessions that he truly perfected it and understood its potential. The seagull effect, as it came to be known among the band and their engineers, became the centerpiece of Echoes. But creating the final version wasn't simple. Gilmour spent weeks perfecting the technique, learning exactly how to manipulate the pedal to create different types of calls and cries. He discovered that by varying his picking attack, his finger vibrato, and the speed of the pedal movement, he could create an entire range of sounds that seemed to tell a story without words. The emotional impact of this accident cannot be overstated. When you listen to echoes today, those seagull cries don't just provide atmosphere. They provide the emotional heart of the piece. They represent longing, isolation, the call of something wild and free. They transport the listener to wind-swept coastlines, to vast empty spaces, to moments of profound solitude and beauty. What makes this story even more remarkable is how it reflects the creative process of Pink Floyd as a whole. This was a band that never settled for the conventional, never accepted that things had to be done the way they had always been done. They were constantly experimenting, constantly pushing boundaries, and most importantly, they were always open to the happy accident, the unexpected discovery that could transform their music. The backwards wah-wah effect became so integral to Pink Floyd's sound that Gilmour continued to use it throughout his career. You can hear variations of it on The Dark Side of the Moon, on Wish You Were Here, and even on his solo albums decades later. But it was never quite the same as those original seagull cries on Echoes, created in that moment of exhausted experimentation in 1971. This accident also reveals something profound about the nature of creativity itself. Some of the greatest artistic breakthroughs in history have come not from careful planning or deliberate intention, but from mistakes, accidents, and happy coincidences that open up new possibilities. The backwards wah-wah effect is a perfect example of how technical limitations or errors can become creative opportunities in the hands of an artist who is truly listening. The impact of this single mistake rippled far beyond Pink Floyd. Countless guitarists and musicians heard those seagull cries on Echoes and began experimenting with their own equipment, looking for their own happy accidents. The effect influenced everything from ambient music to film soundtracks, and you can still hear its influence in contemporary music today. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this story is how it captures the essence of what made Pink Floyd special. They weren't just musicians playing songs. They were sonic explorers, constantly searching for new ways to express the inexpressible. That backwards wah-wah pedal became a gateway to emotions that existed beyond the reach of conventional rock music. Roger Waters later described those sessions as some of the most emotionally intense moments of his life. He said that when Gilmour began to play those seagull effects, it was as if the studio itself became transformed. The walls seemed to disappear, and suddenly they were all floating in some vast, oceanic space where time moved differently and ordinary rules no longer applied. Nick Mason, as the drummer, found that he had to completely reimagine his approach to rhythm when playing alongside these effects. The seagull cries didn't follow conventional musical timing. They flowed like natural phenomena, like wind or waves, and he had to learn to play with them rather than against them. It was a lesson in musical empathy that would influence his drumming for the rest of his career. Richard Wright, as the keyboard player, discovered that his piano and organ parts needed to create space for these otherworldly sounds. He began to think of his role not as providing harmonic support, but as creating an atmospheric foundation that would allow Gilmour's seagull effects to soar and dive with complete freedom. The interplay between Wright's keyboards and Gilmour's backwards wah-wah became one of the most emotionally powerful partnerships in rock history. Years later, when fans would ask Gilmour about the secret to creating such emotionally powerful sounds, he would often return to that moment in 1971 when he first heard those seagull cries. He would talk about the importance of staying open to accidents, of listening not just to what you're trying to create, but to what the music itself is trying to tell you. What if Pink Floyd's final true song wasn't just music, but a farewell letter? When David Gilmour wrote High Hopes, the closing track of Pink Floyd's last studio album, The Division Bell, in 1994, he wasn't simply crafting another song. He was looking back on a lifetime. Childhood dreams, friendships lost, and the slow, inevitable breaking apart of one of the greatest bands in history. And hidden between the notes and words, many fans believe he left us a secret goodbye. Not just to Pink Floyd, but to the very idea of who they once were. This isn't just another track. It's the sound of an ending, wrapped in nostalgia, regret, and hope. And today, we'll uncover why David Gilmour's last song was a secret farewell, one we might not have realized until decades later. The song begins with a tolling church bell. It's not random, it's deliberate. Church bells mark beginnings, but more often they mark endings. Weddings, funerals, farewells. Gilmour chose that sound to open Pink Floyd's last lyrical statement. Then the first lines arrive, sung with a haunting calm. Beyond the horizon of the place we lived when we were young, in a world of magnets and miracles. This isn't just poetry, it's autobiography. Gilmour grew up in Cambridge, alongside Syd Barrett, long before Pink Floyd ever filled stadiums. To them, childhood was magical. Magnets and miracles, endless days of imagination. But the key word here is beyond. He's already saying he's left that place. He's looking at it from a distance, unable to return. The line feels like someone staring into the past, realizing it can't be reclaimed. And the song's music mirrors that emotion. The melody is both hopeful and mournful, a bittersweet blend that immediately tells us this isn't a celebration. It's reflection. The next verse pulls us deeper. Our thoughts strayed constantly and without boundary. The ringing of the division bell had begun. This is where nostalgia collides with reality. Pink Floyd in the late 60s and early 70s were limitless. Every album broke boundaries. Every experiment led somewhere new. Their thoughts truly strayed without boundary. But then came the division bell on the surface. It's just the album's title. But in truth, it's a metaphor for fracture, for the split with Roger Waters, for the creative battles, for the sense that the unity that once defined them had been shattered. By 1994, the band was reduced to Gilmour, Nick Mason, and Richard Wright. Waters was gone. Barrett was long lost. Even though the name Pink Floyd still carried massive weight, Gilmour knew inside that something essential was gone forever. The bell had already rung, and it was a bell you couldn't unhear. Then come the lines that fans quote again and again, words that hit with devastating simplicity. The grass was greener, the light was brighter, with friends surrounded, the nights of wonder. It's impossible to hear this and not think of the band's early days. Nights of wonder, when Syd Barrett led them into psychedelia. Days when they were young, broke, full of dreams. The music world was wide open, but by the 90s, those days were long gone. Syd Barrett had disappeared into mental illness. Richard Wright had been pushed out of the band during the Wall years and only slowly returned. Roger Waters, once the driving force, was now an enemy, locked in bitter lawsuits. The grass wasn't greener anymore. The light wasn't brighter. The friends who once surrounded Gilmour were gone. And those nights of wonder, when Pink Floyd's shows felt like stepping into another universe, had faded into history. This verse isn't just nostalgia, it's grief. It's Gilmour admitting that what they once had can never return. The lyrics then dig into something even more personal. Encumbered forever by desire and ambition, there's a hunger still unsatisfied. Pink Floyd had everything. They became one of the biggest bands in the world. Dark Side of the Moon alone sold more than 45 million copies. Their concerts were legendary, their stage designs groundbreaking. And yet, here's David Gilmour at the end of the journey, saying it wasn't enough. That desire and ambition chained them. That no matter how high they climbed, the hunger never went away. This is heartbreaking. It's the admission that success doesn't bring peace, that the very ambition that made Pink Floyd great also destroyed their friendships and left them isolated. And in saying this, Gilmour isn't just confessing, he's letting go. It feels like a man finally realizing he doesn't have to chase anymore. The song's final moments bring everything into sharp focus. The endless river, forever and ever. These lines weren't just poetic filler, they were foreshadowing. 2 decades later, Pink Floyd released The Endless River in 2014 after Richard Wright's death. But here's the truth. The Endless River wasn't a new creative statement. It was built mostly from Wright's leftover recordings, turned into an instrumental tribute. Yes, technically it was the final Pink Floyd album. But in spirit, High Hopes was the real ending. The last time Pink Floyd spoke to us in words. The last time their story was told in lyrics. That's why fans consider it the true farewell. The song where Gilmour said goodbye. And to make it even more powerful, the music video was crafted by their longtime visual collaborator, Storm Thorgerson. Surreal images of bridges, clocks, floating objects and lost landscapes captured the feeling of dreams slipping away. Thorgerson had worked with Pink Floyd since the beginning, and his vision for High Hopes felt like a visual eulogy. It's no coincidence that today, High Hopes is the most viewed official Pink Floyd video on YouTube. Millions still return to it, decades later, because it feels like stepping into the band's last dream. And then, as the bells toll one final time and the sound fades into silence, it doesn't feel like just the end of a song. It feels like the closing of a life chapter. A curtain slowly falling. Why does High Hopes cut so deeply, even for listeners who weren't alive when Pink Floyd were at their peak? Because it's universal. We all know what it's like to look back and realize the best days are behind us. We all know what it's like to lose friends, to see time slip away, to wonder if the hunger inside will ever truly be satisfied. For Gilmour, those feelings weren't abstract. They were painfully real. He had lived through the rise and fall of Pink Floyd. He had watched Syd Barrett vanish before his eyes. He had seen Richard Wright nearly erased from the band's history, only to bring him back. He had fought bitter wars with Roger Waters. And yet, through it all, he carried on. But by 1994, he knew the journey was ending. That's why High Hopes doesn't sound like triumph. It sounds like peace. Not happiness, not victory, peace. Acceptance that the past is gone and the future is uncertain. It's no wonder fans describe the song as the soundtrack to their own goodbyes, whether to youth, to relationships, or even to loved ones. It's a universal farewell. Looking back now, High Hopes wasn't just another Pink Floyd track. It was David Gilmour's secret goodbye, an elegy for youth, for Syd Barrett, for Richard Wright, for Roger Waters, and for the band itself. Yes, The Endless River came after. But that was more of an epilogue, a tribute. High Hopes was the final chapter, the true ending in words and music, and maybe that's why it remains Pink Floyd's most powerful late-era song. Because it's not just about the band, it's about all of us, about looking back, feeling the weight of time, and finally saying goodbye. So when you hear those final bells fade away, remember, you're not just hearing the end of the division bell, you're hearing the end of an era. And perhaps the most honest farewell David Gilmour ever gave us.